I would strongly suggest for you to read your privacy policy. And nowadays you can throw it on Claude or on
Yeah.
ChatGPT and have it like bring the highlights to you, no worries. The importance is that you understand what the expectations are from the customer point of view. Because the data privacy policy says that we only collect data that we can use to improve your experience. And sometimes with marketers, especially, you're like, oh, I want all the data today. Because the expectation is that we're going to use this data to improve the experience. And if we don't, then we are not delivering on our promise. I was like, let's read it. Let's make sure that we understand that.
What's up, everyone? Today we have the pleasure of sitting down with Ana Mourão, CRM, Customer Data and CDP Advisor. Anna started her career in financial services sector before moving to field marketing and e-com partnerships. She then spent 5 years as a marketing leader at 3M. She created the experimental marketer framework to help marketers take ownership of Martech. And today, Anna is CRM, Customer Data and CDP Advisor, working with Fortune 500 customers, advising on data architecture, digital engagement, and customer journeys. Anna, thanks so much for your time today. Really excited to chat.
Thank you for having me. I'm very pumped to be here with you amongst so many people that I admire that have been on the podcast as well. So thank you.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at NAC. I have the amazing pleasure of chatting with some of the greatest minds in marketing operations, but you'd be shocked at how many of them have the same issues when it comes to their campaign creation process. They're dealing with things like scaling, personalization, keeping assets on brand, render testing emails, working in rigid templates, and worst of all, having to hand code emails. But many of the leaders in the space are using NAC to eliminate these headaches. NAC is a no-code email and landing page creation platform that covers initial campaign requests right until the sync to your marketing automation platform. NAC improves the whole campaign creation process by bringing the building, optimization, testing, collaboration, and also translation functions all in a single spot. So you don't have to jump around and coordinate feedback between a bunch of different people or wait on developers for very simple edits. Because at the end of the day, marketing ops folks want to focus on process and efficiency. Marketers want to focus on creativity, and NAC makes sure you get both and then some. Check them out at knack.com. That's KNAK, and tell them we sent you. Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I'm a huge fan of the experimental marketer framework that you put together. Spent a lot of time reviewing it and studying it ahead of our chat today. So I feel like there's a lot of jumping off points from the framework that you created there. But maybe we can start by chatting a bit about this like strategic angle that you were trying to permeate through the framework itself. I think you like made it to help marketers have a more strategic view, be more hands-on with Martech, but also this idea of becoming better allies and using and getting like the most value as possible from Martech. When I was reading through it, the framework seems to be promoting a mindset shift from being a specialist in certain Martech tooling, like knowing the tech, to taking a step back a little bit, like being more bird's eye view and understanding systems thinking and marketing, but also like other business applications. We're moving beyond like the typical advice of how to be better in Martech, learn to code or get these certifications in these 3 tools, to focusing more on like becoming strategic architects, if you will. Like, is that a fair assessment? Walk us through your thoughts there.
Yes, absolutely. The idea of the framework, which was really based on my own professional experience and everything that I have been doing professionally, is really to give that very systemic view. Help marketers really see Martech as a tool that can help them not only achieve their objectives in terms of customer engagement, conversion activation, but also in terms of improving the marketing processes themselves, right? Helping the marketing teams and helping other teams that are involved. So it's really a framework to help marketers lean in into those conversations instead of just leaning out and leaving to the other stakeholders, leaving to IT or just leave it to ops, because the marketer will have a better view of the processes that could be improved with the technology, for instance. So that's where I came from with the framework.
Very cool. Can you maybe like share a story of a marketing team that transformed, if you will, like this idea of just collecting tools and building a stack to actually building systems that are interconnected and it's not just for marketing? Like what key shifts are like supposed to take place in that thinking and operation that you think made a difference there? Like curious if there's like a story that jumps to mind.
Sure. So, in one of my most recent experiences, the idea was to implement a Martech that would help the company collect end user data, right? So here we're talking about a B2B company, and this B2B company really never had a lot of information about the end user, the person going to the distributor or going to a retailer to buy the product itself. But then they realized that if they had this information, not only they could generate demand on behalf of those retailers and distributors, but could also tap into this end user data when developing new products or when doing the go to market strategy, right? So by having that information, we could be more strategic because we had different teams in different markets working with different brands from the same company, and we needed to empower them, but we also needed to give them freedom within a framework. So even if they didn't have like a specific budget to go and develop an email from scratch, they could still send the email and they could still generate the demand on behalf of their local partners, local retailers, etc. So that's how it all started, right? And at the beginning, we had our marketing automation tool at the center of that stack, and we thought that that would be enough for us. And then we realized that it wasn't, right? Because on the marketing automation platform, you usually have the latest data on the customer, for instance, which is the data that you're going to use for the activation. Perfect. But for Stanley Black and Decker, in this case, we realized that the most important part for the company was really understanding that end user and having that 360 view of the user,
Mm,
right? And that's when we realized, okay, so we need a de facto database at the center of the stack. And at the time, was working very closely with the team that used to be called the data science team for
mhm,
the company. And because all the questions that we had about the database or around the database were marketing related questions, right? The team ended up deciding that a customer data platform would be the best database because it really helps answer marketing questions, right? Because the users would really be marketing or marketing adjacent teams, e-commerce teams, etc. So that's how we started this MarTech, and then we brought the CDP to the center because we could then get information from different sources of data and unify it so that we can use that unified view for the activation, right? So that we know that if Anna joined a year ago and she's more into e-commerce emails, so that can help us better cater the emails to her. Or we can have specific journeys for people that are in this cohort with Anna, right? So that's when we started to be able to see those things. And again, because the Martech stack was really agile, it allowed us to also customize for different brands and markets, right? Because some of those may have even like different data points that they're collecting or different sources of data. And that's okay because the CDP can ingest that data. But then we also created the whole data governance approach,
mhm,
which what really, really changed, in my opinion, what really helped the CDP implementation was the data template. So our agreement with them was the following. The data template is the language that the CDP understands. And that's the only language that the CDP understands. So if it doesn't come formatted in that language, we won't be able to see it. The CDP won't understand it. That doesn't mean that the data is lost. The data won't be lost. The data will be on an ingestion table in the CDP, but it's going to be there. It's not going to make its way to the centralized or
Right.
unified profile for the end user, right? So with that, and by sharing that responsibility and by going through the data template with our business stakeholders, the marketers, the e-commerce managers, that was really what made a big difference, because then they became owners of that data collection and that data activation. And then they understand that if they set up the form right at the beginning and they use the data labels that we have defined in the data template, then the data will flow automatically from the CDP or to the CDP, from the data source to the CDP. Awesome. You don't have to do anything. In like 24 to 36 hours, the data will be there, unified in the marketing automation tool. Go for it. But if you don't, if you just leave that form for a vendor to do whatever they want with it, I don't care. That's too technical for me. Well, then the data won't be on the unified profile. There
Hmm.
is a do-over, so we can do a do-over. No worries, we'll help you. But then you will need to format. You need to go to that source of data, download the thing, format in a very specific format that we have for you, and then we'll do what we call the manual uploading to the CDP, and the data will be there, but it's gonna take more of you, marketer, of you, e-commerce manager. So that was the agreement, the implicit agreement. And that made a huge difference, because with that, they really understood that it pays to pay attention to some of those details,
Hmm.
like the data labels on the forms at the beginning. Because then once that's done, it's a gift that keeps on giving. It's going to be there for you. And I also worked with them to make sure that they understood that the data template is a living document, right? It's
Hmm.
not supposed to be like super, how can I say, static. No,
Yeah.
there's a new, oh, Anna, we need, you know what? We need now to collect the occupation, because that's important to us to know if you're an electrician or a construction manager or what have you. That's fine. Let's do it. Totally. Then we get together, we decide what's going to be the data point, which options we have, we record that, we can translate those data options into whichever language we have and we're going to use. So we can define it in English and then translate into Portuguese, Spanish, Korean, etc. And then that's it. We are, and that also allows for our senior leadership to compare things, comparing apples to apples. There is a minimum set of data, which, and that's also something we define. What is the minimum criteria? What are the minimum number of data points that we need in order for an end user to be in our database and be able to receive email communication. So we need the explicit consent, for instance, right? We need the opt-in. So, okay, let's make sure that the opt-in is always there on the form.
Hmm.
So does your form have the opt-in so that we know that they consented? So those were the changes that really took place. And the beauty of it is that this took place a few years ago for a region like Latin America. And nowadays, they already know. They go to the data template, they create their form. So it requires minimum interaction with me. I barely review those things anymore. We can do more, be more experimental, be more innovative. But if anything, we can also keep the lights on. We
Hmm.
don't need to turn it off. So all this experience actually informed the experimental marketer framework. And that's how I got to the framework, going through this experience first. That's how it came to be.
Very cool. I really appreciate the practical and full story there. There's a lot of jumping off points that I'm really curious to ask you about. There's one that kind of stood out. I feel was like the thesis of your example is like data governance and getting data as clean as possible at the point of collection. Like you talked about forms a lot, and obviously the folks working in the marketing automation tools the point of collection is going to be the form, figuring out what are the fields and standardizing that, like you kind of talked about. But typically for like a CDP implementation or even like adding a new tool or new features to an automation platform, data collection doesn't just include form stuff, right? There's like a whole bunch of
Correct.
other first party data. We're talking about like web activity. We're pairing that with product activity. Are they viewing certain pages on this site? We want to append that information when they're created in the database. So I'm curious to ask you, like, I know that based on that experience, like you've got a lot of experience at cleaning that stuff up. Can you explain maybe like how do you design those feedback loops, not just with the marketing teams creating the forms themselves, but maybe the data eng team who's set up with like all of the tracking codes from the CDP on the site, or the product team who's also adding the CDP tracking code to the product pages themselves. Like, what patterns have you seen be successful with data governance systems outside of just forms and like data engineering teams?
Sure. So yes, I started with like an example that includes collecting attributes, right? But as you mentioned, we also can collect behaviors as the example you mentioned, and those are also documented in the data template in this case,
Okay.
right? So what that helps is that the business stakeholders understand how that behavior is named inside the CDP. So they understand how they can segment based on whichever behaviors we are collecting, right? And then when it comes to an analytics team, for instance, they also have access to it because they also understand how they can pull the data for segmentation and for reporting. And in the case of when we first implemented this Martech with the CDP at the center, we also had some reporting that we did. And we started with very easy reporting, like
Mhm.
Google Sheets, pivot tables, just at the beginning, as
Yeah.
almost as a proof of concept, right? So you
Hmm.
don't need to go fancy or anything, but the data needs to be easy for business stakeholders, for instance, to see and say, oh, okay, I see the data flowing. I see now new end users coming into the database because I have a scorecard. And I go to the scorecard and I can see my market, I can see my brand. And if that scorecard's not growing these days and I have a campaign going on, for instance, then I know there is an issue. And then I can go back to Anna, for instance, and say, Anna, I think that I messed something up and the data is not being collected properly. Or conversely, I can see the data and I understand that if I want to compare the performance of a given campaign throughout different markets, because that also happens, right? We have a new product that was launched in different markets worldwide, and we want to see the behavior of people interacting with that content. Perfect. And then when we see it, if we see that that content is tagged or named differently throughout those markets, it's going to make it harder for us to compare. We can do it, of course, but then again, it requires more, how can I say, intervention
Yeah.
versus something that it's easier to see, right? So let's say we have someone who is in charge of deploying those campaigns with the new product. And it's easy for that person to say, okay, I see how that Canada and US are performing because it's the same tracking, everything is the same, so it's super easy. Versus, no, Anna needs to be there, or someone needs to go there and translate what happened in Canada so that I can compare to the US or vice versa.
Mm.
Right? So that's very important. So the feedback loop would be the reporting. So that's a very important part. So they need to see to help catch and understand, right? They need
Mhm.
to go through the process of putting together a report that may be harder because things were not properly packed at the beginning, right? So that we can say, you know what, if we tag it properly from the get go, you don't have to do this work. Imagine if, right, every Monday you can just like pull up the report without having to do any intervention and be able to report on that easily. instead of going through those interventions. Or even worse, right? I've been in situations where when a stakeholder had such a question, someone would call a vendor and the vendor would prepare like a PowerPoint. And now, and then you end up with like PowerPoints from different vendors in different markets. And how do you compare those? Right? How do you know if the data is really, you're really seeing the data as it is, or if you're seeing the data as the vendor wants you to see the data?
Mm,
Right. So all those discussions, those are a lot of the discussions that I bring along with the process, with the governance, right? Because those are the pros. Yes, it's gonna be hard at the beginning. So a lot of governance, especially for Martech, has a lot of front work, as I call it. I don't think
yeah.
that's the proper nomenclature, but you upfront your work, right? You do the work
Yeah.
at the beginning, and then that work keeps on giving at the end.
Hmm.
Because if you have like campaign tagging nomenclature that is used and it's just modified according to the campaign, but it's the same one for all brands, all markets, or all business units inside a company. Awesome.
Yeah.
Because then you did the work of creating that formatting. But then from there, it's going to be super easy. You can have the intern creating your tagging, or you can
Hmm.
have the director creating your tagging. That will work the same. Perfect.
Hmm.
Right? Or you can have a
Yeah.
vendor helping, but then we can pull the data ourselves and check the vendor's work as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of those discussions because my experience actually is with like older companies, not digital companies, not the
Yeah.
software service
Yeah.
industry. And in those cases, a lot of the marketers or marketing adjacent positions are not as close, right, to understand those things yet. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of education there as well.
Hmm. Education and change management and introduction to new ways of doing work and
Yes.
graduating from legacy tech. I'm sure there's a long list of stuff there. This episode was brought to you by our friends at Census. You probably have what, over 15 tools in your marketing tech stack? But how many of them have the full picture of your customer's journey? Census is the universal data layer in your stack. It unifies and cleans data from all your sources and makes it available for any app to use. Census makes it super easy to unify and standardize customer data, then enrich and enhance it, like running deduplication, cleaning, scoring, and routing workflows, and then sync and activate that data across all of your tools so you can actually do something with it. For marketers and data teams that work together to power big campaigns, it's so refreshing to work from a reliable source of truth. Don't just take my word for it though, since this is loved by awesome companies like HubSpot, Perplexity, Canva, Clay, Notion, and many more. Check them out at getcensus.com and tell them we sent you. I feel like one thing that comes out of your answer that resonated with me, you're almost like building this thesis that it's incredibly important for marketers at digital companies or like older companies to take ownership of customer data instead of just
Yes.
leaving it to technical teams. I think like forms is a bit more approachable for marketers, but all of that other box of first party data, like tracking stuff, especially when we're talking about CDPs, usually the IT team is like picking up that stuff or like the data team or the technical team, right? How do you think, like, what advice do you have for marketers to, like, marketers listening right now are just like, Phil says this all the time that like marketers need to get closer to the customer data and like pick up better data literacy, but they're super busy already with like a bunch of stuff on their plate. They're focused on promotional, their growth, like they already have a bunch of operational and technical responsibilities. How can, like, what advice do you have for marketers to like take first steps at developing a more holistic view of marketing and rev tech, and especially folks that are maybe a bit earlier in that like customer data literacy journey?
I would say go talk to the IT teams, to your ops
Mm,
team, so that you can understand how the data is collected and unified. So, and then again, you don't need to go and understand if they're using Python or whatever language. No, you need to understand, okay, I get data from those data sources. They come to a place where they're going to be unified. So, first of all, and that's a question that I was asked, if we collect data from different sources of data, is there our hierarchy of those sources of data, right? Is there one that is more reliable than other? So in some cases, we would say, you know what, if we have data coming from customer service, from a Zendesk, let's
Mhm.
say, that would be preferable than the data that comes from a giveaway promotion. Because people that are looking for customer service, they're going to give more data or more truthful data or what have you than someone just going for a freebie,
Yeah.
right? But those things are things that the marketers are the most prepared to discuss, right? And that's the thing. Marketers are, and I used to be on that camp as well, like, oh no, things are just resolved like magically. And then I have the technical people asking me, telling me, like, no, there's no magic. There's a lot of decisions. And those decisions are really going to impact the way you work. So are you sure you don't want to be part of those conversations? And I'm like, yeah, you're
Mhm.
right. Let me be part of those conversations. So that's how I got involved. Because at the beginning, I also thought, like, no, you decide. And they're like, well, but what if the information that I'm prioritizing is not the most reliable source of data? Wouldn't that affect your activation, your promotion? Yes, it would. So why are you not here with that? So that's how I got involved. And that's what I would suggest. I know people are super busy, and I know that marketers nowadays are very involved in promotion, right? And sometimes in the acquisition piece. So care acquired, yeah. Next. But if you take the time just to understand how this data comes and how it is unified so that when you are doing your campaign planning, you know if you can tap into that data and what that data can bring to you and how it can help your campaign and your promotion, that already puts you way ahead of a lot of other marketers, a lot of other professionals, because a lot of people are not doing it. And you don't need to invest a lot of time. You don't need to know programming. You don't need to be certified in any programming or in any platform, right? You don't need a such and such certification to do that. You just need to be curious, to knock on people's door and ask. I just want to have a look here. And what happens is that when you do that, you also contribute to the technical people, to the IT team or to the ops team, right? Because sometimes they are making those decisions on their own without
Mm.
guidance from marketers because the marketers are like, okay, that's not my thing.
Right.
You take it, right? And they're making those decisions sometimes kind of trial and error because they're not the ones activating the data. They're not the ones collecting the data. They're not close to the campaign as the marketers are. Right. And that's exactly what I want to change. It's that mentality that, oh, I can't just like leave it to my vendor or leave to IT or
Mm.
to ops and they can do it and my campaign will perform and that's it. No, let's make sure that we understand. And the other thing I would say, which that one, I think it's going to be like a hot take, but I would strongly suggest for you to read your privacy policy.
Mm.
Read privacy policy, people. And nowadays you can throw it on Claude or on
Yeah.
ChatGPT and have it like bring the highlights to you. No worries. It's
Remove
easy.
the law speak out of this.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
give it to me in easy and simple terms.
Mhm.
You can totally do that. But the importance is that you understand what the expectations are from the customer point of view,
Mhm.
right? Because a lot of times when we talk about like, let's add a new point of data to our CDP. Okay. Do we have content against that point of data? So if I
Mhm.
collect, I can use to improve your experience in our digital properties. No, we don't. So maybe it's not time to collect that data yet, the data point yet. Let's hold on, right? Because the data privacy policy says that we only collect data that we can use to improve your experience.
Mhm.
No more, no less. Right. And sometimes with marketers, especially, you're like, oh, I want all the data today. Like, oh, let's test everything. More is more. And it's like, well, yes and no, right? Because the expectation is that we're going to use this data to improve the experience. And if we don't, then we are not delivering on our promise. Right. So even those things I was like, let's read it. Let's make sure that we understand that. So a lot of times when we get together to discuss those new points of data, that those are the points that I'm gonna bring back. Right. And in a lot of times I'm like, oh yes, that's right. We need the content. So then they work on the content while we are starting to develop or to collect the data. That's fine too. We can do things in parallel. But then soon enough, we'll have content to then customize your experience in our digital properties using the data you gave us. Right. So those are the two main points, which again,
Mhm.
I know it usually not what the marketers like to hear or not what they do, but it's what can differentiate you. And all that, a lot of the governance, I actually came up with it by discussing with IT, by discussing
Mm.
with the data scientists or the data integration engineers, right? Because any good data integration engineer, when they see that what they do all day long is just to clean data and reconcile data that comes like all messed up because business stakeholders do not bother to not even like try to collect this thing. That's when they're like, okay, that's not the place for me. I
Mhm.
don't want it. No professional would like to spend their time just cleaning data and reconciling data, right? Versus the data comes in as clean as possible. So it's really about connecting new sources of data. It's really about how is it that we can prepare better data sets for reporting? How is it that we can start thinking about being predictive in any way we want, right? So let's see how much data we need to feed those models, etc. Those are the conversations that usually data integration engineers, data
Mhm.
ops people like to have.
Yeah.
But if they're just dealing with like messy data because marketers cannot bother in tagging their campaigns correctly or fixing a form, right? Then it's harder. It's harder even to develop that relationship, that partnership with those teams, right? So the moment I was like, okay, I understand that. So rest assured that we are going to be the front line to stop like unclean data. We will make the most in our power to make sure that the data come as clean as possible so that we can really go to the next level. That really strengthened our partnership because they're like,
Mhm.
okay, I can count on them. They are partners with us in
Right.
collecting and reconciling and unifying that data. It's not like, oh, you take here and do whatever. We are invested. We have skin in the game.
Mhm. Yeah,
So that
exactly.
also helps a lot. And it helps a lot with analytics teams as well, the teams that are going to put together the dashboards.
Mhm.
Because then they'll come to you and you can say, okay, those are the business rules. This is how the data is collected, right? So business rule, for instance, oh, anytime we have a campaign that is e-commerce, the word e-com will be on the tracking tag. So whenever we talk about e-commerce related campaigns, make sure that we pull the e-com out of the tracking tag and they're going to be good throughout the many markets, many brands, right? So we document those things and it makes it their work also much easier. And then it
Mhm.
gets more interesting because we can do the fun stuff, right? The promise of Martech is really to help marketers and the other stakeholders involved in being more strategic, in being more predictive, right? Nowadays, clean data also feeds systems, right? Like reinforcement learning or AI or casual AI, you name it. All those systems, they need data and they need clean data. Otherwise, it won't make sense. Or you will spend a lot of time cleaning the data in order to make sense, to see if it was worth it. So it's like,
Yeah.
no, right?
Yeah.
Let's make it easier so that we can then realize that value. Oh, we can already be predictive, or we can save money on our campaigns and make our little budget go a little further. All those things. So that's pretty much I would say, the essence of the experimental marketer framework.
Very cool. That I think that's great advice. I feel like it's a bit of a two-way street. Like I think, obviously marketing ops folks, Martech folks, they need to be curious to, like you said, knock on those doors from the IT teams. And, I've had differing experiences there too. Like there are some IT and data teams that are more open to like opening those doors and having those conversations with the Martech folks. And, it's different with data scientists. And we talk about, the analytics team as well. Like you've got a lot of experience with bigger companies and all of those separate departments there. And I feel like that's what makes the role of the Martech Pro really interesting in that like they're almost like a pseudo product manager with all the
Yes.
stakeholders and all the areas of collaboration that they have, right? Like you just said, the role of marketing ops is supporting marketing and all of the other stakeholders that are part of this journey of implementing Martech. It's not just supporting marketing. So I'm curious to ask you, like, with your experience of like working with these bigger teams, all these cross-functional teams, how do you help teams assess potential ripple effects across stakeholders of MarTech changes? Like, what's your framework for impact analysis of changing something on the collection side of data or the activation side? Like, how do you just help all these stakeholders bridge the gap between these different teams during like big, hairy MarTech projects?
So a way of doing this is really, again, leaning in, talking to those teams and asking them. So what is the pain point? Right? Because a lot of so again, if we collect data that is not clean, we're increasing the pain point for IT or data ops, right? So the moment that we improve our process as marketers, that is going to positively affect the other teams down the road as well. And if
Mhm.
everything is well documented, it's much easier, right? Versus finding people throughout, I don't know how many platforms, different sources of data, different data points named differently, it's much harder. So by helping it, what seems to be like something very simple and linear, marketers can help all the way through IT, through ops, all the way to the lawyers, all the way to
Mhm.
data privacy and data security. But in order to know that, you have to go and ask.
Right.
You have to lean in, right? You cannot say, oh, that's not, no, no. I can't be bothered. I'm doing the
Mhm.
campaign, but I can be bothered. No, let's try to be that partner, right? I want marketers to be good partners to IT, good partners to marketing ops, good partners to the lawyers, right? Because Phil, what happens is that when you're talking to those people, they make a lot of fun of marketers and a lot of the jokes, I'm like, oh my God, it's true. I cannot even complain because it is true. That is that is the case, unfortunately. So in order to not be that Gilbert cartoon type of stereotype of marketers,
Mhm.
right? Let's be more hands-on, let's be more proactive, and let's be there. And again, I don't know how to code Python. I don't have any fancy enterprise certifications. You can even look at my LinkedIn. I have some stuff that I've learned, but it's not there. It's not what I go by. But I still can help because I know marketing processes. I know pain points. I know how hard it is for marketers to understand those things and to get started. So I can be the one helping them get started and then they take it on. It's easy. Once it's in place, it's easy for them to take it on and be those very proactive partners,
Mhm.
not be the stereotype marketer anymore
Yeah,
because they
yeah.
know. And then they can be in meetings with technical people and hold their ground and have meaningful conversations. And it's a beautiful thing when that happens because on the
Yeah.
technical side, also, they get so happy when you explain that it's a campaign where we lower the cost of acquisition because the data was so well managed. They get so happy. And
Mhm.
usually they don't even have that feedback. It doesn't make it back to them, right? So sometimes in a lot of calls with data ops or IT, it's about telling them what our idea is, what type of engagement we want to bring, and what type of data we want to use. And they get so excited. They're like, oh, that's so interesting. And what happened? And then the next call, they will ask me, what happened with that campaign? Did it perform good? How
Mm.
was it? And what are your thoughts? Right? So It's so interesting when you connect those two things, they work so well together. And unfortunately, they're still far away in company, and again, in large
Yeah.
companies or in legacy companies that are not digitally native, right? Because I understand like companies that are digitally native or smaller startups, they may be tighter and the marketers in there may be more hands-on. But
Mhm.
in my world, in my experience, it's not there yet.
Yeah. I've definitely have more experience on the startup side and the digital native side, but I think that's something that still happens regardless of the size of company is like you just said there, this idea of like holding your ground and like sometimes there's a lot of positive stuff, but sometimes there is conflict when it comes to Martech implementation. And this is something that I've struggled with at pretty much like all of my past roles. Like it's like we're implementing something new or we have a problem, we're trying to find a solution. I, as the person who's heavily involved with Martech, and sometimes I was the marketer on the marketing team, I've done my research. Like I've chatted with other experts who face this problem. I've read a bunch of guides. I read other people's frameworks. I did my own research. I have my own past experience. I have a good idea of how something should be solved. But sometimes this idea isn't shared with other technical counterparts who maybe didn't do the same research or don't have the marketing use case or background that I do. What's your playbook for getting alignment between marketing and technical teams when it comes to conflicts like this? Like, how do you help both sides understand each other's constraints and requirements before conflicts arise, other than obviously like, knocking on doors and having those conversations? Like, what else comes to mind?
So what I also like to do is to start small, right? So for instance, with implementing the CDP, we started with a POC, a proof of
Hmm.
concept that was super small. Was we got two markets, one brand each market. That's it, right? So one of the markets we got one that in this case Brazil, because for one of our brands Brazil has a specificity that it's only theirs that we don't have in the other markets. So we're like, okay, let's get that case that's a little harder for us to test, just to make sure that we're kicking the tires in the best way possible here. And then we could see, okay, so we did the POC and we were able to see the data coming, right? I was able to see the data unified. I was able to help on unification again, prioritizing which sources of data, etc. And then the data was ready for me to use in the marketing automation platform. So there we could already test against a lot of the pain points we had. The pain points on data cleaning and unification, and the pain points on us having the data ready for activation. And it worked well. Okay, so we were able to take those pain points from the different teams, yes. And that also helps us with data privacy and data security because we did it with APIs and everything was done properly, etc. So yay. Okay, so we got that done. Is that okay for everybody? Right? So before implementing anything big, anything major, we always do something smaller and then we kick the tires and we reconvene and we analyze it against the criteria we had when we first selected. So we had a list of criteria. That's what we want to do. We did the POC, went back to those criteria, checked against our pain points, and then it worked. And then we proceeded to implement into all like 20 markets, 4 brands each back then. Right. And then, okay, because if we had any comments or any issues or any questions, we would say, you know what? We did the POC and that's what we saw. And that's why we are where we are now in the implementation. Is that okay? Yes. Awesome.
Yeah.
So
Do you ever
that's
do
how we
multiple
do it.
POCs at the same time? Like, what if the technical team is just like, I don't want to do a POC for that thing. Like, I think the solution is something completely different. And like, is there ever an area where you're doing one POC for this one side of the conflict, and we see how that works? We take notes, and we don't make a decision until we do another POC. Like,
Oh,
how many
yes.
POCs do we do to satisfy conflicting opinions before we just like put a line in the sand and say, like, this is what we're
This is
going to
the
go to
one.
bat with.
Right? So it really depends on, so the most important part here is to define what you want to achieve with the platform through the
Yeah.
POC, right? So in our case, we wanted to have that unified view. So that was one of the most important criteria. We need to have that information over time. Over time is important to us because we don't know the end user. We are not used to have this data. So we need to know when Anna became part of the database, etc., so that I have that more detailed view. So that was first one, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't need the POC. We could be just using the marketing automation platform and sending the latest data or relying on real time use cases. A lot
Yeah.
of companies do, and that's fine. But it was not our case specifically here. So we need to define that, right? We also took into consideration the pain points. So that's why I want like what we want to achieve and then the pain points. So the pain points, we have small teams at this point,
Mhm.
right? So we need to make sure that we also automate some things that allow us to move at a good speed, a timely fashion speed with the teams as they are now without a lot of dependencies on vendors, consultants, because we don't know if we're going to get that budget at this point, right? Does that check? Check. So yes, right? So a lot of, uh, it really comes down to having that list. But to get to that list, right, you need to have a lot of conversations with the stakeholders. And you need to have some conversations where I was like, okay, so tell me what the pain point is. I didn't ask in those terms, but it was a lot of discovery to understand where the resistance was. Because
Mm.
sometimes the resistance was on this. Oh my goodness, they think they're going to start sending me a lot of unclean data, and I'll need to be cleaning data. I'll need to hire someone. I don't know
Mm.
if I have the budget. What if I don't have the budget? But sometimes the person has all that knowledge, but she's not bringing it to the call,
Mm.
right? So a lot of it was also me probing a little bit. So
Mm.
what is the concern here? Is the concern that the data won't come clean? Because that can be resolved. It can be accommodated. We can help. Give us an opportunity to test that, and we can show you that we can do that or put that as a constraint. So whenever we are analyzing those platforms, I know that I cannot even think of increasing the team to ingest or digest data in order to get a platform. If it requires for us to grow the team, it's not a good platform for us.
Mm.
Remove it. Right. One of the criteria also that we had with the CDP back then was that the company, the CDP company, needed to guide us because some CDP companies that we saw back then were very self-service, right? Which then it works super fine if you have a team of developers. But we didn't. We had like two. So
Mm.
that was one of the criteria that we put there. We need the
Mm.
hand holding because otherwise we're going to be running circles for too long, and that's not advisable at this point. So all those things we had to have. We had very, how can I say, frank conversations,
Mhm.
right? And it took us a while to get there, really a while. But it was a lot of back and forth,
Mm.
right? A lot of, so in our case, when we got to the POC, we already had selected a tool because it had already met the criteria. So the POC was really to kick the tires and make sure that at the end of day, on the day-to-day basis, it would really meet what we needed. And it did. Awesome. Otherwise, we would have to go to the runner-up or start the process all over again and see if we could find another vendor or if another type of platform that would meet our needs. But there's a lot of conversations here and a lot of, so I think that I would say for marketers, if you bring the pain points, if you bring the issues that you have in your team and you open that up to the other stakeholders, that is very helpful,
Mhm.
right? Because then they can understand, well, you know what? The issue for us is that we have very limited teams, we have a limited budget. So anything that helps us decrease the cost per acquisition will help. It's going to be awesome because that's a pain point for us. We need to do more with less or more with the same, right? Or conversely, I need the teams to be able to do their own stuff or to tweak a template inside the platform in a way where I can review or in a way where that is recorded because if there are any errors, we can catch it and rectify it. Right. So when we bring that up to the other teams, they're like, oh, okay, I understand. So my team also has those type of pain points or limitations. So we need to take
Hmm.
that into consideration too. Right. And those conversations, of course, you can have external consultant vendors helping, but a lot of those conversations really need to take place within the company. Right. So what are the teams are going to do on a day-to-day basis with those? Because the consultant won't have that view
Right.
a lot of times, or
Mhm.
the vendor won't have that very in-depth view, but you do. So that's why I tell marketers, lean in because you are the one who knows those things. You live and breathe that. Don't let
Mhm.
someone else decide. Don't let a vendor come or a consultant come and decide that for you, without your input. Go and make yourself heard. Bring your experience, bring your processes. And that is how you can contribute without knowing how to code or etc.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
point.
No, I think your advice is really spot on there. I love the point about bringing the pain points and not just like complaining about stuff, but like explaining why this is a pain point. Like, not just I hate this tool. I hate this tool because I am limited in my ability to be able to do this, or it takes a lot more time to be able to do this, or the data is a lot like, I really like that point because I think marketers are really good at pointing out problems, but don't spend enough time explaining why this is a problem and assuming that
Exactly.
everyone knows the world of a marketer, right? Like, there's a lot of assumptions there, and this has been a super
Exactly.
fun conversation. There's a lot of jumping off points we didn't get to touch, but I think that you brought a lot of practical examples and real world stories here, so folks are gonna really appreciate that. I got one last question for you. We ask
Mhm.
this question to everyone on the show. You're a CDP advisor, obviously a marketing leader, a keynote speaker, an author, a mentor. You're also a mother, a home baker, an amateur photographer, and a busy cat mom these days as well. Um, how do you find balance between all the stuff that you're working on while staying happy?
That's a very good question. So I I like to I have the moments of, for instance, my weekends, my nights, I like to dedicate to my family, to my baking, to the kitties, right? To relaxing. But on the other hand, I'm always on the lookout as well, right? Because I like connecting dots. I think that a marketer's work is largely about connecting dots,
Mm,
especially when you work for large corporations like myself. So I'm always on the lookout as well. So even if I'm like relaxing and like reading the newspaper or just browsing through LinkedIn, I may read something and like, oh, that is interesting. That connects to that
mhm.
conversation or to that issue that we were discussing. So that may be an interesting hypothesis for us to test in order to improve the issue. So I say that as well for later conversations. So I don't know if I have exactly like a proper balance, but I think that I can go on and off, right? Enough that I can connect the point without burning out. So I'll put it this way.
Great advice. Yeah, definitely like the connecting the points advice there. Sometimes you discover those points to connect when you're not doing work, like physically sitting in the
Exactly.
office, you're going outside, walking, or listening to podcasts or something. It's like a completely random, like fictional story or book, and you're just like,
Totally.
oh wow, like this could be applied to this. Yeah, and it's just super fun. I really appreciate your
Mhm.
time. I'm gonna link out to your newsletter as well as the framework for folks. I'll probably like put it up for the folks watching on YouTube. I'll have it up while you're kind of going through it there. But really appreciate your time, Anna. Thanks so much for being here.
Likewise. Thank you, Phil. It's been amazing.